Well, here we are, doing what I never imagined I would be doing, recording a message on video to be played on Sunday. Here I am at the house. In some ways, our situation is new and different, scary and uncertain. And yet, in this moment, it's our reality. It's what we're facing, and what I think we need to do and always should be doing is looking to Jesus. For he is the Word, and we get our word or message from him for our lives, including today. So let us turn to Scripture to hear what Jesus has to say to us. Passages that I'm looking at are from the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, chapter 37, the vision of the valley of dry bones. Hear what Ezekiel saw. The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? I said, Sovereign Lord, you alone know. Then he said to me, Prophesy to these bones and say to them, Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded. And as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, Son of man, and say to it, This is what the Sovereign Lord says. Come, breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, Our bones are dried up, and our hope is gone. We are cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, This is what the Sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord, when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord. And now turning to the letter of Paul to the church in Rome, chapter 8, I'm going to start reading at verse 6. The mind controlled by the sinful nature is death, but the mind controlled by the Spirit is life and peace. The sinful mind is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those controlled by a sinful nature cannot please God. You, however, are not controlled by the sinful nature, but are in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God lives in you. And if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, they do not belong to Christ. But if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who lives in you. Well, I want to look at two aspects that come out of this passage, these two passages. The first is hope, and the second is life. When we were reading that passage from Ezekiel, we have to remember where Ezekiel comes in the timeline of God's people. He was a part of the time when Israel was taken into captivity. And Ezekiel had this vision of dry bones after Israel had been taken into captivity in Babylon. In fact, Ezekiel himself had been taken into captivity. His vision was of the people of God, and they being dead, dried bones in a valley, on a valley floor. Israel had been defeated, and the Israelites were a broken people. They were without hope, and this, however, was not the end. God had a plan for them. The Lord was going to do something, and this is just the beginning. For the message of the Lord given to Ezekiel is that God was going to turn their situation around. Death and hopelessness were going to be reversed. Bone to bone, taking on flesh, tendons, and skin. And this would come to the people of God. And most importantly, breath. Breath, the very life of God, poured into God's people. This idea of breath coming into God's people, doesn't it take us back to that moment when Adam and Eve were in creation, were given the very breath of God, and were created as living beings? That's important. And so the defeated, destroyed people of God were going to become again the people of God, living beings. And this is only because of God's doing. The Lord was going to do it. As the Lord declares, I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it. But in our time, in our place right now, what has happened to us in the last 2 weeks? How much of our own hope and vitality has been drawn away from us, drained away by this pandemic, by these new rules of social distancing that we have, of being ordered to stay at home. How dried up have we become, having to be quarantined from each other, living without physical contact, without getting too close? And what about these hard times for our nursing homes and other health facilities? They're closed to visitors, even close family members. And that's tough, really tough. And only in the situations where hospice is involved, or at the very end of life, are only one or two family members allowed in to a hospital. This is really tough. But what about the ongoing hardships? Families with healthcare workers and people who are working in businesses that are still open to the public. How do these families relate and deal with when their loved ones come home after being in a hospital, after being business facing people all day long? How are they going to conduct their lives at home? How quarantined, how separate from their spouses, from their children does this require? And also, what about those planned events that are around us? Those once in a time occurrences that are being forced to be either postponed or canceled. Proms, graduations, weddings, funerals. All these things are important, and we assume we're going to be there, but not under the conditions of a pandemic. In this moment, when there's so much that could lead us to be hopeless, how much can we find our hope in turning to Jesus? What about the Spirit of God that raised Jesus from giving him life? How much will that life give us life to our mortal bodies, even though there's that unseen virus in our world? Here again, the message penned by the Apostle Paul for us in verses 10 and 11. If Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is alive in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who is alive in you. So our hope, our life in this season of pandemic comes from nowhere else than from the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead. Even if we might be told by our gut, our gut's telling us to go in a different direction. Hear me out. There's a story told by John Ortberg who tells of his friend Jimmy and his son Davy, who were swimming in the ocean in Mexico. They had gone there with their families who were on the beach, and suddenly a rogue riptide swept the son Davy away from shore. In fact, it was taking him out to sea. Dad Jimmy saw what was happening, and as he went to help Davy, he too knew that he was being swept out to sea as well. And he was a strong man. He was an Olympic decathlete. But in a few moments, Jimmy realized that both he and his son Davy were in trouble, and that they might drown. And so he was horrified to think that there, as his family was on the beach, they might be having to plan a double funeral. However, meanwhile, Jimmy's cousin, who was on the beach, saw what was happening. He knew the beach, and he understood about riptides. And he walked out on a sandbar as far as he could to get as close to Jimmy and Davy as he could. And just then he lifted up his hand and said, "You come to me. You come to me." Then Jimmy and Davy saw him, and rather than swimming towards the shore as they had been, they turned and swam parallel to the shore to where Davy was at, or their cousin was at, and they were saved. In these new, different, and scary times that we're a part of, is not our best effort put at following Jesus, even when it doesn't seem maybe like our gut is telling us that's the way we go? Think about the signs of hope and life that are around us. I've seen on the nightly news about those cities in Europe and in North America, when 7 p.m. rolls around in the evening, people go out on their balconies, out into the streets, and begin to cheer and shout and give applause to the healthcare workers that are working hard to get us through. And what about those places where we see musicians taking their instruments either out on balconies or out into the front yards and begin to give concerts, free concerts, with music to fill the day with something more than the sounds around us? And what about the signs of life around us? Just being outside this afternoon, I could hear the peeps in Gull's Woods cheering and making sound as hard as they could. But what about more signs for us to be about? What about those? I was thinking about those who are starting to or have been doing their homework. Yep, doing homework is a sign of hope in life. Keep doing it. And what about all of our farmers and who have livestock? Yep, they're going to keep them fed and watered. We're going to need the food later. And those healthcare workers in our midst. Yes, going to the hospital, going to those agencies of healthcare to give aid and care to people who are in need. Yes, that's a sign of hope, even with the dangers that provides. We can also keep in touch with our neighbors across the fence, just checking in to see how they're doing. And what about phoning people who come to mind in the middle of the day? Don't hesitate. We've got the time. Call. And how about making sure that all those around us are safe and sound? These are all efforts that help us and help others to see that there is hope and there is life in the middle of what we're facing. Yes, as Jesus guides us, may we be a people of hope and life in these days. May the Lord be praised. May we give praise to the Lord, and may those around us also give glory to his name. Amen.